So let's go ahead and try to get started in a conversation specifically about the impact of Malcolm, the impact of Africa on Malcolm and Malcolm X's impact on Africa. So let's try to have a conversation in here tonight. So I want to rush through these as quick as possible because I really want to engage in a conversation. I like to, really disrupt space, that I'm not up here trying to teach and trying to tell you or fill you with information, but provide bits and pieces of information that we collectively organize into knowledge, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and let me see what we can do here. All right. So this is me. What I like to do is just to contextualize and see who you're talking to. I think it's important to always know who you're talking to, why you're talking to them, and what gives them, kind of like the opportunity to stay in and thinking with you. So my intellectual formation is a community of organic intellectuals. Organic intellectuals is a conceptualization that comes out of radical and revolutionary work that says that we all are intellectuals. We produce knowledge. And so the organic intellectual comes in a revolutionary praxis in Gramsci and other people, but it's something that's related specifically to African descendant people. We produce knowledge outside of the institutional frameworks. So it's a community of organic intellectuals who are determined to resist and revolt. That's the community I come out. I was educated and taught at Howard University, Georgetown University, University of Maryland, and also Virginia Commonwealth University. Those who know, I actually graduated from Virginia Commonwealth University as an undergrad. That brought me all the way to where I am today. My worldview is a radical Pan-African humanist, collective, disruptive, and internationalist. I center Africa in every particular perspective on every issue that has to, whether it's global, whether it's local. So I am unashamedly a Pan-Africanist, radical, humanist, and collective. My practice, as Dr. UC mentioned, is to extract, map, and study and find ways to apply frameworks of Africana radical intellectual histories and revolutionary praxis. This person here, I'm gonna call Cabral, is somebody that I study consistently because he is someone who freed Guinea-Bissau, fought Cape Verde, and was very, very instrumental in the Black radical and also Black power movement here in the United States. So I'm gonna call Cabral. We'll talk more about him as we move forward. I feel like I'm out of breath, but I shouldn't be. Setting the terms of our engagement tonight, we want to create a collective and generative space to think together. The idea within the creation of, quote, an Mbangi, which is a Kikango concept that comes out of Kibusinki, is that through community, we solve our problems and also nourish our creative ideas, suggestions, and innovations. It translates roughly as room without house, room with no walls, that nothing could be hid, conflict, knowledge production, and all of those particular things must be done in a collective process. This is who we are as African people. So setting the terms of our engagement, again, please forgive this text. I'm going to go through these, okay? What this conversation this evening, sorry, there was a misspelling, is an attempt to map, trace, and highlight the intellectual development and influence of and on Malik Shabazz. This is not a historical conversation tonight. We want to study the intellectual range, the development of Malcolm, the influences. What is the tradition within which Malcolm represents? We do not separate Malcolm from a longer tradition that came before, from our Maroon communities and our ancestors who resisted enslavement, and also all the way till today. He is a very, very important archetype that we should study. We will not identify or follow a linear pattern of arresting this development in dates or temporality. This is important, right? We're not just going to be talking about dates, even though I will have dates up there just for context. But the idea here is to map and trace, how did Malcolm develop? How did he evolve? What was the catalyst to evolve in his revolutionary praxis? And what we're going to look at is East Africa. That was a very, very important part, and we're going to see why that became very important. We are intent to identify, highlight, study what can, and in this current moment of crises, Malik El Shabazz offered by retracing his development. What are the ideas that he left? What are the questions that he left for us to answer? What is our responsibility in this moment to study Malcolm, not just as the person, but as a genealogy, a lineage within the context of African and African diaspora people? This conversation is intended to be collective, to pull on the collective intelligence gathered in this room. Some of you probably read Malcolm. Some of you probably heard Malcolm. Some of you have probably studied Malcolm yourself. So I say that to give me an out, because if I misquoted a date or something, y'all not gonna beat me up, okay? But I think I did a good job in highlighting it. Okay. So if I do make that mistake, please, by all means, this is collective, okay? I just want us to be there. What are we doing tonight? We're moving information into knowledge. Information is not knowledge until you organize it for a expressed purpose. Otherwise, it's just bits and pieces of information. If I throw dates at you, if I say Malcolm 1964, and I can give you, what color shoes he had on and all that other stuff, what does that mean if we do not organize it into knowledge? And so what we're going to be doing tonight, I'm going to be giving you a panorama, a map within which we'll be able to trace in his intellectual genealogy as we move throughout tonight, okay? So our journey today is about walking down a path that opens into many paths. So what I mean is that what I'm saying to you tonight is not the definitive. It is just a path within which we can study Malcolm, within which we can situate Malcolm in a long tradition of radical revolutionary thinking based upon a humanist perspective, okay? The questions of we're intentionally thinking through the impact of revolutionary Kenya. You're going to see why in a minute. There are conceptualizations of Malcolm. There are dominant narratives of Malcolm that we have, but it's very, very important to pay attention to what happened in East Africa, generally, but in Kenya more broadly, okay? More broadly. So we're going to look at the Land and Freedom Army. The British called them the Mau Mau. That's a misinterpretation. To call them the Mau Mau is a colonial language that the British imposed on the rebels who were resisting British colonialism throughout the 1950s. Very important. And it was very interesting because having had conversations with Ngugi wa Thiong'o and have had him on the radio program, who wrote a lot on the Land and Freedom Army, it was important for the British to use Mau Mau because it was closely associated with some type of psychological disorder. So they called them the Mau Mau means that they were doing something outside of the order of the colonial structure. But think about this. Suppose they started to call them the Land and Freedom Army. Now you're locating what they're demanding in an intentionality. They're not crazy. They want their land and their freedom, right? So we'll talk about that. Pio Gama Pinto, Odinga Odinga. Odinga Odinga should be important, specifically if you're studying the Snick singers, the Snick, Sweet Honey in a Rock, and the Snick singer to come out of there. There's a song that they have, Odinga Odinga. Who was Odinga Odinga, right? That becomes important. And then, of course, Abdulrahman Mohamed Babu. Who are these figures? And then what strains of thought and practice are important to the current moment? And so what I wanted to do is really give a framework, just a suggested framework to how we should begin to understand Malcolm in this current moment. He is not historical. Everything that he talked about in one particular point in time is relevant to this moment that we're living in right now. So in order to do this, it's important for me to reconceptualize history, to take history out of a linear process, this process of specifically a linear process of dates from this date to that date. But we know in an African cosmological system, time is a cyclical process. You ever heard that history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme? That's very important, right? So that is something that is useful in the context of how African people conceptualize time, which is very different. That's the reason why they put pejoratives, they call us late, they do all of those nasty things. Well, no, we're on a whole different cosmic level of time. We're not late. We move when the spirit moves, right? We move in certain particular instances. That becomes important, right? So what I wanted to do is for us to be able to understand what I'm going to try to do tonight is I'm going to present how do we use history, right? Everybody knows about Sankofa. Everybody knows about the notion of to go back to bring forward. But the question is, what are we going back to get to bring forward? Right? So uses of history becomes important. Just even in the context of Sankofa as the bird itself, very deep philosophical, cosmological, philosophical, political, cultural understanding of the world that comes out of what was the original name of the region that's called Ghana today was Ouagadougou, right? What did Africans term or what did Africans use to describe their own existence? So Sankofa. So we want to reconceptualize history. And this is where John Henrik Clarke becomes very important for me. My students obviously will see this. I see this all the time. And this is from a 1996 speech that he gave us, specifically looking at how reconceptualizing history. History is not everything, but is a starting point. History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is a compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, what they must be. So in order for us to utilize history as a framework, as a lens to move up, down, sideways, backwards within the context of history, history becomes this framework, and we will use John Henrik Clarke's definition as we move forward, okay? So a few things before we really get started. 2025 is the 100th anniversary of Malik Shabazz's birth. That was just last year, so this will be 101. But not only in 1925 was Malik Shabazz born, which again, the 100th anniversary was 2025, but also that year, Patrice Lumumba was born, Frantz Fanon was born, Robert F. Williams was born, and so was Medgar Evers. If you know the genealogy of these particular people, it becomes very important to see where Malcolm was even born. He was born in a revolutionary genealogy that these people changed the trajectories in many different ways. We want to look at more intentionally and contextualize Malcolm, Malik El Shabazz in Africa. What can we learn? What work was started that needs to be picked up? And then we want to propose a way to understand the historical significance of Africa and Malcolm X, or Malik Shabazz, sorry, and set a framework for practicing and applying what is understood. Okay? Everybody with me? All right, good. So now we're going to get into some dates, and there's going to be a little bit, I'm going to be doing a little bit of reading, all that other particular stuff, okay? So Malcolm in Africa. Malcolm made at least 4 trips on the continent. The first was in late March, early April 1959, and then again 2 months later, and finally 2 trips in 1964. And of course, these trips become very important. That last 2 trips are very important in Malcolm being able to, well, actually, it was the CIA that was important too, because they knew they had to get rid of him, and you're going to see why in a minute. So in May 1964 in Ghana, Malik Shabazz reflected on the welcome he received in Nigeria. This is what he says. So he's in Ghana in 1964 in May. And then this is him talking about, and this is where he gets the name Omawale. Omawale, Malcolm X, is very important, right? So he says, when I was in Iban, at the University of Iban last Friday, the students there gave me a new name, which I go for, meaning I like it, Omawale, which they say means in Yoruba, the returning sun, the sun returns home. So what you're understanding in this particular reflection of him reflecting about reflecting about Nigeria and Ghana is that he is becoming open. He's really opening not only what he learned from his mother and his father, and then obviously his own study, because be sure, Malcolm studied and read consistently and insistently. There's a story that Oscar Michaud, the owner of I forget the name of the bookstore in Harlem at the time, used to just throw him keys when he left, because Malcolm would be in there reading, they would be just lock up. thinking that Malcolm would leave, but when he would come back in the morning, Malcolm would still be there reading consistently. Another thing, Malcolm used to meet with John Henry Clark. He used to meet also with Vicky Garvin, Queen Mother Moore, and Marvell Cook. There's also documentation specifically that Vicky Garvin and Marvell Cook, who were communists, used to always tease him to be like, I'm gonna make you join a communist party in the course at that particular time. And he would just laugh it off. But just to show you the intellectual genealogy and also the expanse within which he was in Harlem as he's developing, as he's practicing, as he's teaching, and also learning himself. Okay. So I point out this here. So again, he made those first trips, 1959, then again 2 months later, then finally in 1964. But one of the points that I think is important, it was in June 28th in 1964, shortly after Malcolm made his Hajj. He comes back and he develops the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And what I have here is with the aims, and I'm so glad this is a huge screen, the aims and the objectives of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. This is an important institution because in between those trips, and once he founds the Organization of Afro-American Unity, once he goes back to Africa, this is where the material revolutionary instances pick up, particularly once he gets to Kenya. So once he meets Pio Gama Pinto, he meets Rahman Babu, who he actually meets earlier. We'll talk about that. So here is the objective and aims that were developed for the Organization of Afro-American Unity. A. Peter Bailey, who was one of the people that helped Malcolm found this, is still in DC, alive and does a lot of talks. I've had him on Africa World Now Project if you're interested in hearing his reflections on Malcolm and what, that as well. So the Organization of Afro-American Union, I'm not going to read this too much, but here's some of the aims. Don't forget Ella Collins, his sister, very, very essential because she was integral in actually supporting Malcolm to even go to Africa, right? She gave him money and also helped him develop the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which also was very responsible in developing their objectives to include and center Black women. There was that there. So the first objective was to free Black Americans from economic oppression, create business opportunities and jobs, establish an environment of security, stability, dignity, initiative for our youth, demand justice whenever it becomes evident that the laws as composed and enforced are contrary to the welfare and well-being of our people by any means necessary. Okay. Really quick note. There is obviously a misnomer that Malcolm preached violence. He did not. He preached what? Do you know? Armed self-defense. Very important. The reason why I wanted us to understand that is because this goes into a tradition. Remember the person I said that was born in 1925, Robert F. Williams? A year before Malcolm actually heard Robert F. Williams, who was from North Carolina, a revolutionary from North Carolina. If you don't know, he wrote Negroes with Guns. He escaped, the KKK, goes to Cuba, develops Radio Free Dixie. And then, of course, rebellious as he was, they end up saying, hey, go somewhere. So he goes to China. He comes back in, and ends up living out the rest of his life and teaching at the University of Michigan. He was also very responsible in the first president of the Republic of New Africa, free the land in the context of that. So Robert F. Williams was the one who gave that particular instance to train people for armed self-defense. Another historical, the Deacons of Defense in New Orleans, even before then. So We Will Shoot Back is Akinele Umoja's book. Charlie Cobb wrote a nonviolent, that nonviolent stuff will get you killed. And of course, Negroes with Guns are two sources where you can see that in the South, Black folk weren't just letting the KKK come. A lot of times the KKK were going into places that they thought that they actually were able to bully, which wasn't that many places, right? So Black folk were literally in armed self-defense. So Malcolm understood this. But what we're going to see is that he understood that this needed to be organized in a particular way, that Robert F. Williams and Mabel Williams was teaching people in Monroe, North Carolina. Robert F. Williams got kicked out of the NAACP because he was teaching people armed self-defense in Monroe, North Carolina. Shout out to NAACP. So this is where we're going to go back. We're going to slow down, and we're going to come back to that second longer trip to Africa from July to November 1964, where he visits extremes of countries, where he met a range of intellectuals and political figures. And in Egypt, he spoke at the Organization of African Unity, not the AU we see today. That is a neo-colonial construct, but the Organization of African Unity that comes out of the call by Kwame Nkrumah in 1959 in the All African Peoples Conference to unify Africa as a United States of Africa. So Pan-Africanism in that particular instance. He talks with Nasser in Ghana. He meets Shirley Graham Du Bois, Maya Angelou, and in Tanzania, Abdulrahman Mohamed Babu, Julius Nyerere in Kenya, Odinga, and Pio Gama Pinto. Okay. Everybody good? So Malcolm's speech at the African Summit Conference, which was this, right? The OAU. And what I have up here, and I thought it was important to just put a part of here, because you can see Malcolm is really now taking what he was practicing and organizing in the context of the United States. He's now taking this to the heads of government in Africa as they are also decolonizing themselves. Okay. So the speech that he gave August 21st, 1964, the Organization of Afro-American Unity has sent me to address this historic African summit as an observer to represent the interests of 22 million African Americans whose human rights are being violated daily by racism of American imperialists. I'll just stop there. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Now, we see he evolved. So I'm glad you asked that, Dr. because you see his language begins to evolve. And the language is evolving because his intellectual understanding of what is needed to fight imperialists and colonialists becomes even more important, okay? So you see, obviously, human rights. If you know anything about Malcolm, and you watch any of his particular speeches, even as he is being pushed out of the NOI, the speeches that you can look at and see when he starts to be very clear about human rights is the message to the grassroots, Black Revolution, and Ballot or Bullet. Ballot or Bullet, yeah, Ballot or Bullet, yeah. You start to see him being very clear, and of course, this is rubbing the leadership of the NOI, but he had already, by that time, found out the information he found out, and so it really was pushing him to be more clear, because of course, if you know, again, about Malcolm, he was a very principled person, morally trying to develop his character, as in Ifa, character is the most important thing that we can develop, okay? If those of you who know Ifa, okay, good. Okay, I thought they'd go over your head. I didn't want to go over your head. So when we look at this, so he's addressing them. So he's also saying there is that he is making sure that African leaders understand their connection to African people of African descent here in the United States and their struggle. So what he's doing is really laying the groundwork, as you're going to see, in a longer genealogy that goes back to the 1940s with people like W.E.B. Du Bois. And in 1951, people like William Patterson and the Recharge Genocide Petition, where they're charging the United States a genocide and committing human rights violations. As early as 1947, which got Du Bois, when he was kicked out of the NAACP the second time, by the way. I know he was kicked out twice, right? He was too radical. He was kicked out the first time, they kicked him out the second time, right around the 1940s, where they asked him to develop and what would become an appeal. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. So what you see what Malcolm is doing is that, number one, he's very well read. He's understanding history. He's understanding that W.B. Du Bois wrote in the 1940s something called an appeal. And I'll give you that whole name, because in the 1940s, Du Bois literally writes an appeal to the denial of the human rights, so forth. That's a long title. I'll have it up here. I'll show it to you. And then, of course, you have William Patterson. These, of course, are very, very clear radicals, socialist, communist, radical, revolutionary people. And of course, William Patterson is the lawyer. Okay. All right. Where's my mouse? So here we go. All right, bear with me. I know I said I was going to give you dates, but as I was doing this, I actually came back in and put this slide in because I was like, you know what? I can't do this without giving you the dates. This is all the slide you're going to get for this. All right. So this becomes important, right? So when I talked about those trips, these are the trips between 1964 and then also February 1965. Okay. And I wanted to pull up something here on my computer. Because I have a little bit more on these timelines here. Here we go. All right. All right. So remember, he makes his Hajj. He does that, right? Now understand that, when he first goes to set up, set up the conditions when he's with the Nation of Islam to set up the conditions for Elijah Muhammad to go. So again, it's very important. So in May 1964, he goes to Mecca, Beirut, and Cairo. He goes to in Nigeria in May 1964. Look at this. Look at the time. He is busy, right? May 1964, he's in Mecca, Beirut, and Cairo. Then he's in Nigeria and Ghana in May 1964, with visits in May 1964 to Monrovia, Dakar, Morocco, and Algiers. And in that May, the dates he's in Monrovia, Dakar, Morocco, and Algiers is May 17th through May 21st. Okay. Then he comes back to New York and founded the OAU. So you see why I went back and I made sure that I put in that the OAU was a very important institutionalized process where he's institutionalizing the intellectual and practice for revolutionaries and radicals across the world. This is what the OAU is intending to do. Then he goes to London and Cairo, and then further east to July, September 1964. And of course, I have Kenya, Tanganyika, which is Tanzania. Tanganyika is the older name. Zanzibar, Addis Ababa, October 1964. Very important period. Then he returns to Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, Guinea, Algiers, Geneva, and Paris through October to November in 1964. He goes to Paris, November the 22nd through the 24th, 1964. Then he returns to New York, November the 24th, 1930, 1964. He goes to England, December 1st, 1964. And then he's back in the United States in 1964 and between 1964 and February 65. I want to pause there. Those dates become very important, particularly as he comes back to the United States, December 1964, because he had already been to Tanganyika, he's been to East Africa. But what happens in February 1965? He's killed. He's murdered. So when he comes back to the United States in December 1964, between December 1964 and February 1965, he addresses Harvard Law School Forum. He notes that African statesmen towards the U.S. had acquired a new tone and a new tempo. Okay, so let me just go back up here. So we see that he's obviously he's traveling, but then something happens here. He's traveling, he comes back, he comes to the United States, and something happens. You begin to see his language become very, 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 very clear about the coloniality, the colonial issue of African people, even here in the United States, okay? Then he goes back. So February 1965, listen to this. And he goes to Britain and Paris, and he's in Britain and Paris between February the 6th to the 11th. Okay, it's very important. Yes. I'm getting there. I'll get it there. That's exactly. So when he exactly. So there's I have notes here. I didn't put it up there because it just threw it in. But yes, he absolutely, when he goes back after the United States, he addresses Harvard Law School and a number of other talks. Is very clear. He's very clear, but he also knows that he has support from African leaders to take the question of Black folk to the UN under human rights charges. So he's clear. So now his language, and he's very clear because he has the backing. Because in the address for the Harvard Law School forum that he gives at the end of December, he says African statesmen's attitude towards the US has acquired a new tone and a new tempo. He goes to Britain. He leaves the United States. He goes to Britain and Paris, February 65. In London, he's in London, February the 6th through the 8th at the Committee of African Nations. He flew to Paris on the 9th, was scheduled to give a talk called Afro-American Struggle for Freedom, but he was barred entry at that particular point on the 9th. He flies back to London and is there from February the 9th through the 11th. After this trip, Malik Shabazz arrives back and continues to develop his analysis. For example, after the 11th, he's back. He gives a talk at Columbia University on February 18th, 1965. He told students this: "It is incorrect to classify the revolt of the Negro as simply a racial conflict of Blacks against whites, or as a purely American problem. Rather, we are today seeing a global rebellion of the oppressed against the oppressor, of the exploited against the exploited against the exploiter, colonizer or colonized." Note, this is about months away. He gives us, obviously, February 18th, 1965, and we know what happens after that. But I wanted to also add a note, months away from his 40th birthday, right before he left London for the last time, he told Jan Carew, a reporter, that the chances are that they will get me the way they got Lumumba. This is right before he leaves London, right? He flies back to London, he leaves, and he says, again, the chances are they will get me the way they got Lumumba. So Malcolm is very clear. Now, I just want to go back to this particular statement. I don't want people to get the misconception. He was evolving and sharpening his critique of race. He wasn't this post-racial. No, I don't want people to make that mistake. Post-racial, he was evolving it to a particular purpose to link it to capitalism, colonialism, so forth and so on. He was not post-racial. I want to be clear about that. I don't want nobody to come up and say Dr. Pope said, Malcolm was a liberal. No, he was very clear. He was sharpening his analysis, and you will see as we go forward, okay? Tariq Ali, who met Malik El Shabazz at the Oxford Union debate, you can look at that. I think that's on YouTube. What Malcolm witnessed, this is his reflection in an interview, because he met him because he was one of the student organizers to actually get Malcolm to the Oxford Union to get into that debate. And when he had a conversation, people asked him to reflect on it. And so what he said, what Malcolm witnessed in Africa gave materiality to his changing political views. I want us to be careful with changing. I would say evolving and sharpening, but be careful with that. But this is him in his recollection. Soon after his return, he gave a speech drawing parallels between European colonial rule and institutionalized racism in the United States. The police in Harlem were like the French in Algeria, like an occupying army, right? He's very clear. He's evolving. He's understanding, what is happening? What is this structure? What is race? How is this? Its afterlives are institutionalized. Malcolm began to fully articulate, as he had in speeches before, the connection between racial oppression and capitalism, where he suggested that Afro-Americans should emulate the Chinese and Cuban revolutions, observing that of all countries that are emerging today from under colonialism, they're turning towards socialism. I don't think this is an accident, right? Again, it will be what I think is important. We'll get to how we study this. Is what does that mean? How does that look? I would argue that his relationship between understanding African indigenous knowledge systems from communalism restructuring society based upon collectives, he would have moved that way. Because if you understand Islam on the continent of Africa, particularly in West Africa, as a revolutionary force, you will begin to see these connections, specifically in Sufism. I just wanted to make that note there. Okay. Again, I'm only making frameworks. I'm not making declarative statements, because I think it's very hard for us to say, what will Malcolm do, right? He left the framework for us, or what is our responsibility and what should we do? So after this, and the reason why I said let's pause. So now let's see. He comes back from Tanganyika, Zanzibar, Addis Ababa, of course, and Kenya. And then you see language, you see it becomes very clear, very sharp. His practice becomes very, very clear, because again, something happened here. So let's take a pause and see what happened there, okay? So according to his notebook, this is him. This is what Malcolm is saying. This is not no interpretations. This is exactly what he's saying. So according to his notebook, Malik Shabazz left for Nairobi on October the 5th, 1964, flying in from Beirut. In his notebook, he noted that he saw no mixing in Nairobi, and the agents are getting worried about the future. There seems to be an invisible force trying to bring disunity between Africans and Asians, okay? Again, evolution, right? Malik Shabazz wrote further, Kenya was a place, this is a reflection on Kenya. Kenya was a place which really knocked me out. If I ever saw any Africans who looked like they had the potential for explosion, it's our Kikuyu brothers in Kenya. So now he's also understanding what happened with the Land and Freedom Army. Because again, when he goes there, I know there is a reverence, particularly in the diaspora, for Jomo Kenyatta, but Jomo Kenyatta betrayed the revolution. All of my Kenyan friends talk about this. He's not respected in the context of Kenya as he is in the United States, because he betrayed the revolution. And so we're going to be clear about that, because you'll see why in a minute. So when he's talking about this explosion, because just like the civil rights movement in the United States, where young folk begin to see the limits of civil rights legislation, and then of course the murder of Dr. King, of course before that, Malcolm X, the explosions. This is also happening because there's a betrayal happening with the revolution in Kenya. So Malcolm goes to Kenya right in between this particular period where there was a declaration of independence based upon the revolutionary of the Land of Freedom Army. But then there's a betrayal happening that he goes, and at the same time, some of the same people, such as Pio Gama Pinto, Odinga, are being marginalized, and we'll see why in a minute, okay? They look like they can explode more so than any place we went on the continent. You could just see right in their faces, energy, and that's proof that they can explode. They exploded the other day with the United States with their criminal action in the Congo, and that's what it was, a criminal action in the Congo. They marched on the embassy there in Nairobi and tore it up. This is historical. You can literally go back to that particular point and see when that happened, right? So he was there. And that shows you what the Africans feel, okay? Let's move forward. So on October the 7th, as he's in Kenya, again, let's go back in here so you're still following me here, right? So October the 5th, he flies into Nairobi. Of course, you could probably imagine he's on all type, he meets Pio Gama, he spends time with Pio Gama, Rahman Babu, as we're gonna see. But then on October the 7th, Malik El Shabazz phoned Odinga's office to meet, after likely being introduced to him by Pio Gama Pinto, Odinga's close advisor. Odinga believed in democratic socialism, and shortly after being appointed by Jomo Kenyatta, they began to clash, as Odinga was very critical of Kenyatta's alliance with foreign capital and Western powers. So he becomes very vocal. Odinga, and also Pio Gama Pinto begins to become very vocal in public, as Malcolm is there, against Jomo Kenyatta. By the way, side note, put this in your pocket. C.L.R. James, you know that name, C.L.R. James? C.L.R. James met Jomo Kenyatta at one of the Pan-African Congresses. And he wrote about him and basically said he don't like him. I'm gonna give you the nice words. He said, I don't like him because he looks like he will betray people. He says this very early at the Pan-African Congress, right? Very important. Okay. All right. So Odinga believed that democratic socialism. He begins to fall out in public because Jomo Kenyatta is moving the country or betraying the revolution. Okay. Pio Gama Pinto and Malik Shabazz meeting and time together is very important to highlight for a number of reasons. Pio Gama was a revolutionary who was imprisoned during Kenya's liberation struggle for supporting the Land and Freedom Army, often supplying them with material support to wage guerrilla warfare against the colonists. Remember that. Remember that last part. Remember that last part, yes. Yes, colonialists, colonists, both. Yes. No worries. So Pio Gama Pinto, often supplying them with material support to wage guerrilla warfare against the colonist colonialist oppressor. Pio Gama Pinto was assassinated 3 days after Malik Shabazz for his involvement with those beginning to fight against what was described as Kenyatta and his clique of rightists close to the neo-colonialist. Pio Gama Pinto was organizing opposition to challenge Paper 10, which was essentially the legalization of capitalism in Kenya. Pio Gama was assassinated on February the 24th, Malik Shabazz on February the 21st. Very important. Remember, they just meet. And we're going to see that there was some clear declarative support from Malcolm, not only bringing the issue, but again, some material support to wage guerrilla warfare. This is approximately 3.5 months after Pio Gama Pinto and Odinga, as well as other East African revolutionaries, such as Mohamed Babu of Zanzibar, who all agreed to provide material support for Malik Shabazz, including taking the question of Afro-descended people in the US to various international organizations on human rights and criminal charges against humanity. Very important. Okay. In an interview for the Pan-African, which was a publication of Pinto's Pan-African Press, so one of the things that you notice, specifically in the context of revolutionary or radical praxis, is that there are dimensions there. There is kind of like a discourse that goes out in public. So there's writing, there's video. There's TV, there's radio. The printing press was used during abolition. The technology was used during them, okay? So Pio began in this interview, began by asking Malik Shabazz of the importance of his name and then his reflections on the Civil Rights Act. Malik Shabazz responded, American legislation cannot solve the type of racism that has become an inseparable part of American political, social, economic systems. It takes education, not legislation. Since the passage of the bill, since the passage of the three civil rights bills, since the passage of the bill, 3 civil rights workers were murdered in Mississippi. Pause. Those 3 civil rights workers, right? Another Negro educator was murdered in Georgia. During the summer, there were riots during which the police used clubs to crush scores of Negroes. They used vicious dogs. The Civil Rights Bill is not only used as a propaganda trick by America that impressed the African and that impressed the African and Asian nations into thinking that she is doing something meaningful to solve the problem that she actually cannot solve because it's too deep. Pause for a second. We do know that Brown versus Board of Education had to be decided twice, right? Right? This becomes important. The reason why there's an article called Brown as a Cold War Case. If you Google that, it comes up, it's free. And it's by a legal scholar who actually did a legal autopsy on how did Brown versus Board of Education actually get passed, because it didn't pass based upon the morality of the court. What she found is that they begin to have a bunch of amicus briefs. that were sent by the State Department and corporations. Amicus briefs means friend of the court. Am I right, legal scholar? Friend of the court, which basically means that you can write if there's a case. You can write a legal brief in support of one side or the other. So people have done this consistently. And what they found is, and what she found was, is that they were never going to desegregate. But it was only when they started to get flooded by these amicus briefs from corporations and other particular State Department. And what these amicus briefs was saying this: listen, these African countries are decolonizing and they're ready to do business with us, and y'all messing up our money with segregating schools. This is literally what's happening. So the notion of desegregating schools is based upon an economic imperative, right? Becomes very important. Brown as a Cold War case. Okay. So again, folk are very clear. Now, folk were very clear on the ground of what was happening here as well. So Pio Pinto then asked Malik El Shabazz, sorry, about the militancy of the movement in the United States. Malik El Shabazz replies that this militancy is a product of a number of convergent tendencies that include the independent struggles on the African continent. This moves into, once you get into the 70s, the African Liberation Support Movement and all of that. Amilcar Cabral is actually coming back and forth. Kwame Nkrumah, of course, is in, by this particular time, he's in exile, right? Because he goes and is overthrown in a coup by the CIA. For clarity, Malik El Shabazz states, as long as Africa was colonized, the colonizer projected the image of Africa and it was negative. And this made people of African origin in the West not want to identify with Africa. And as the image of Africa was negative, the image of themselves was negative. But now Africa is projecting a positive image. You find that Black people in the West are also projecting a positive image. They have more self-confidence and they are stepping up their drive in the struggle for freedom. So again, you begin to see the foundations for Black power, Black studies, all of this stuff is converging, okay? Now, Malcolm is clear. He's having a conversation in an international, and this is in a paper that is international, has circulation throughout East Africa and also the rest of Africa. Okay. As they begin to conclude, Pio asked Malik El Shabazz what he planned to do when he returned to the United States. This is what he says: "We are involved in a program to bring the problem of our people in the States before the United Nations and try to make the world see that the United States government is just as much responsible for violating the human rights of 22 million Black people in that country as in South Africa for violating the rights of Africans in Mozambique and Angola. Instead of continuing the struggle within the confined areas of civil rights, which keeps us under the jurisdiction of that government, we need to internationalize it by making it a human rights problem. And then ask the world to support us in a problem that is no longer an American problem or a Negro problem, but is a world problem." Think about think about Dr. King, and when he gives this conceptualization of a world house in one of his last books, Where Do We Go To From Here? One of his last books. So Dr. King is even developing this. Now, that embryonic seed is planted in Dr. King when he visits Ghana in 1958 at the invitation of Kwame Nkrumah. And then this opens them up as well. But of course, that's a whole different story. This isn't a long tradition. So when this notion of taking the United Nations, taking the United States in front of the United Nations, this isn't a long tradition. Remember, I mentioned to you in 1947, Du Bois wrote an appeal to the world, a statement of the statement of denial of human rights to minorities in the case of citizens of Negro descent in the United States of America, and an appeal to the United Nations for redress. He's very clear about what he's talking about and what he wants, right? Very clear. And then, of course, William Patterson in 1951, the We Charge Genocide, which is a historic petition to the United Nations for relief from the crime of the United States government against the Negro people. Both of these are online. I encourage you to read them. Particularly the Recharge Genocide. What you see here is a Paul Robeson, who is a very close friend with William Patterson, and he is delivering the petition to the United States Representative for Human Rights. And I think that is, I know it's in December. I think it's between the 10th and the 13th, I believe. But he's handing that to the, I guess as some people say, if it wasn't a picture, then we don't know if it happened. So, I guess that's a long tradition. Another important catalyst was Malik Shabazz's comradeship with Abdulrahman Mohamed Babu. Not only did Babu meet with Malik Shabazz on October the 3rd in Beirut, so remember, he meets him. So Babu is a very interesting character, not character, but revolutionary. He's moving around, right? He helps free his particular country, then helps Tanganyika, is dealing with Kenya. Very, very important, okay? So he meets him on October the 3rd in Beirut before his October the 5th flight to Nairobi. He also met with Malcolm much earlier in Cairo, again, at that particular meeting. So he meets Babu very early. If you're interested in a more substantive conversation that explores this, I invite you to go to Africa World Now Project on SoundCloud or any of your podcasts and listen to part 3, Applying Malcolm. And I'm going to show this later, but I just wanted to highlight that now. We actually hear Babu in New York in the 1990 at a conference that was organized by people like Abdullah Kalimat, Black Workers for Justice, to focus on Malcolm X. It was called Malcolm X and Revolutionaries. I forget the name of the conference, but a very, very important conference. When you hear people who was there, you had Yuri Kochiyama, you had everybody, Vicky Garvin and Babu. And so he's talking about, and so I have literally that speech on that particular program. So you can hear what they're saying themselves, so what he's saying himself. So Malik Shabazz introducing Babu on December the 13th, 1964, the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, highlights their close relationship. Again, I'm trying to give you a sense of this long tradition. And each one of these slides literally can be a class, y'all. Like you can just go, trying to go through this as fast as possible. So brothers and sisters, again, at this time, a very good friend of mine, I'm honored to call him my friend. He treated me as a brother when I was in Dar es Salaam. Again, Dar es Salaam becomes an important place in revolutionary African or Africana history. Dar es Salaam becomes at one particular point in time, and there's other programs on Africa World Now Project where we focus on revolutionary Dar es Salaam as being the incubator of revolution that takes up the mantle from Ghana, because of course Ghana is co-opted, Nkrumah's thrown out, and then of course you have Dar es Salaam. And so I have programs on that as well. What I tried to do is also make sure I cite my sources for you all as well. Most people don't think of revolutionaries as family men. All you see of him is his image in the battlefield. But when you see him with his children and his wife and that atmosphere at home, you realize that revolutionaries are human beings too. So this is also very important. He's humanizing. He's making sure that we're clear about the work that is being done for our people also requires same work that needs to be done in family life. Okay. We're almost done. That night, Mohamed Babu was running late, forcing Malcolm to improvise, which presented a little problem for him. So this was when he began to improvise. So that night on December 13th, 1964, look at that date, important. After the speech given by the social critic Dick Gregory, now this speech is on YouTube. I highly recommend that you listen to it. Dick Gregory opens up, Malik Shabazz took the podium a second time, again, to raise awareness about U.S. imperial aggression in the Congo, and then corporate media and Cold War representations of African political leadership. Before introducing Babu, Malcolm explained, you and I should practice the habit of weighing people and weighing situations and weighing groups and weighing governments for ourselves. Now he's talking about study. Now he's talking about developing a consciousness built upon study, okay? We talked about the Land and Freedom Army. So he's not only aware of the Land and Freedom Army and that instance where they are resisting colonialism in Britain, He didn't read. This person here is Didan Kamathi, one of the field generals of the Land and Freedom Army, very, very important. But he's now interacting with people like Pio Gama Pinto, Odinga, and other revolutionaries who took part in this particular struggle, right? If you're interested, these are just two programs that I've done. The first program is a program I did with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who passed away, the revolutionary Kenyan writer, theorist. And the second one is with a sister named Rowinga Wahome, who's part of, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, part of the Kenyan Organic Intellectual Network, who are taking on the tradition of revolutionaries in Kenya and radical history, including Malcolm X, because they consider him to be part of Kenya as well. So we know the Mau Mau movement was a nationalist anti-colonial rebellion that took place in Kenya during the 1950s, primarily led by Kikuyu people, but was also involved members of other ethnic groups in Kenya who were opposed to British colonial rule and export. So this particular period becomes important. This is all fashioning, this is all feeding, all informing Malcolm. So not only is he clear about how to wage struggle in the intellectual realm, he's now beginning to understand also how do we deal with things such as the police in communities. And so this becomes important. Okay. So what does all of this show? What frame can we extract from this history? An approach to studying El-Hajj Malik Shabazz in Kenya. So some things for consideration when we look at Malik Shabazz in Kenya are this notion of nationalism, an approach to self-determination as it was conceptualized during the period of nationalist revolution. My question is, thinking about Malcolm and thinking about his interactions with the revolutionaries in Kenya and in East Africa, and I would have loved to see his interactions with the Southern African revolutionary movements, because that would have been very, very interesting. He did not live to see them, but that becomes important. Angola, Mozambique, so forth. And also the opportunities that he probably would have had with Amilcar Cabral or Augusto Neto and, Walter Rodney and so forth and so on, okay? So some questions that I think for us to be in, to kind of think about as a framework for studying this particular period to understand why and how Kenya and East Africa was important, because he began to develop and strengthen a nationalism. I say a nationalism because I don't think it was a traditional nationalism, because understanding how Kenyan revolutionaries, even inheriting that revolutionary tradition in Kenya today and engaging with them, they're looking at something other than the nation state. This becomes important. I'm thinking autonomy, I'm thinking nationalism in its true form through a communal Africanism, something like that, okay? This is where the Land and Freedom Army is key. What were their aims and practices? What was the role of the oath, the system? Because the Land and Freedom Army took an oath system. This becomes important to study in the context of revolutionary practice, ethics as well. And also the merging of revolutionary theory and practice, his interactions with Pio Gama, Odinga, Abdulrahman, and of course, him being very, very close. So imagine the stories that he set for days, talking with the revolutionaries, meeting folk, because when he came to Kenya, people came. People came to see him, people who engaged in struggle. There are, and I'm going to show you this once we get to the end, the Kenyan Organic Intellectual Network is actually documenting that history. They're writing books on that right now. When he was there, what were people saying? Because of some of those people, even though most of them have passed, what I mean is who was engaged in the Land and Freedom Army, some of them were still living where they were able to collect those interviews and stuff. And then, of course, expressions and continuities of Pan-African practice. El Shabazz articulated at its highest level an evolution in the practice of institutionalizing and sharpening Pan-African practice is essential. In April 1964, Malcolm asserted that the single worst mistake of American Black organizations and their leaders is that they have failed to establish direct brotherhood lines of communication between the independent nations of Africa and the American Black people. So Pan-Africanism is taken out of the theoretical and placed into practice, or practical. So in December 1964, after traveling from May to December, I'm sorry, after traveling from May to December, he began to talk about his evolution again. This is in late December. This is before he's murdered, right? A change I've undergone in a similar one. I don't intend to let anyone make my mind. Become so set on anything that I can't change it according to the circumstances and conditions. In my 5 months of travel, I've learned a great deal because in each country that I've visited, I've spoke with people at all levels. I had an open mind. My travels have broadened my scope. I can get along with white people who can get along with me. And whatever I did or do, even if I make mistakes, they were made in sincerity. I'd rather respect a person for their sincerity than anything else, especially when you're living in a world that's so hypocritical. This is an era of hypocrisy. So what does this mean, or how do we, or all of this stuff, how do we make sense of this? For us in this moment, there are a few paths of thought. This is where I will show you the Kenyan organic intellectuals. So what I'm doing now as we come to a close is show you how the tradition or what Malcolm, or how we understand the tradition or the ideas of Malcolm have lived on, okay? So this is the Kenyan Organic Intellectuals Network. This network is what you would call organic intellectuals. These are young folk. Some of them have schooling, some of them couldn't go to schools, but they live in what are considered to be the slums outside of Nairobi. And they've created study groups, organizing groups. They're connecting. And so in the tradition specifically that Malcolm laid, this is me developing a direct connection with them because I've traveled so much. I actually was there as they were thinking about this whole idea. So we were sitting down thinking about this structure of education that years later that they actually developed. So this is one instance of how we can look at it in contemporary times. Here is an article, if it pops up. Here's an article that I wrote that actually conceptualizes Malcolm's theory as well. I will make this available to you. I keep this available even though journals don't like that. I make it publicly free until then I'll get an email every now and again. They tell me take it down. I take it down for a day, then I put it back. Because I just don't believe anything should be knowledge should not be behind a paywall. I don't care in any instance. But this is an article where I take all of this, what we've done, and give it even more context. I give a theory that El-Hajj Malik Shabazz is developing a critical Africana human right consciousness that includes a practice, right? And so this article, if you're interested, I will make it available for you, and I'll show you where you can get it in a minute. Of course, Abdullah Kalimat just did some lectures not so long ago. Abdullah Kalimat is one of the founders of Black Studies. He's working on a book on Malcolm right now and his interactions and all that other particular stuff. But this was a series of lectures, 5 lectures that was developed last year where he goes over specific speeches and dissect them. Message to the grassroots, so forth and so on, Ballad of the Bullet. And so he utilizes that. This was something we were thinking about. He did this, we did this, and I did something else, including this as well. And I'll point that out in a minute. Here's some selected work. I highly recommend you all to actually go to this website, which is called akalimat.org. Brother Malcolm, this is an extensive archive. I mean, I really don't know what to say. I mean, even if you look at the time, look at this. He's documented all of this. All of this stuff is available for you. It's all for free. He's documented everything from 1919 to anything that had to do with Malcolm, all the way up until 65, 66. Speaks to the militant form. This is a very important resource. I highly recommend you to. Then, of course, Black Men Build actually did something I thought was really dope. Not only because they had me, not only I had something to do with it, but there is a study guide. Okay, maybe more. Okay, so they actually just did a last year and this year. They did. Okay, this is not popping up. Sorry about that. They did they republished a study guide that Abdullah Kalimat and folk were doing back in the 1970s, and I'll show you that. I have a link for that up there as well. And then, of course, you go to I highly recommend you, highly recommend. My students always get a kick out of this. I've done more work on Malcolm. Here is actually if you go to just do a search for Africa World Now Project on SoundCloud, but it's on all podcast platforms except for Apple. They kicked us off. They said we're I don't know what they said. They just kicked us off, but we know why. But I'm on every other podcast platform. If you're interested in hearing not only Malcolm himself, here's a number of programs that were developed on Malcolm. Last year, I did a series with the Kenyan Organic Intellectuals Network where we focused on Malcolm, Lumumba, and Fanon and how that shows up in the work that they're doing today. Very fascinating. And also, they love to connect with folk too. So if you're interested, I would actually, get on Africa World Now Project. I like to talk about this one. I don't like to, but this was done months before the invasion on Palestine. This whole conversation that I had with two of my comrades and colleagues, literally, because I don't know if you all know this, but in 2020, Israel was also bombing Palestine as George Floyd uprisings would happen. So when we saw October the 7th, a year later, we had already talked about the groundwork that set the stage for that. So you can see that even though this program this is constantly shadow banned. I don't know if y'all know what shadow banned is, but if you're interested in that, so any things that we've been doing on Malcolm writings, connecting with that. So I say all of this to say, or I share all of this to say, not for no type of promotion, but to show you I'm interested in the questions that Malcolm left. What are the contours of the thoughts, right? How do we take the tradition and the intellectual and practice that Malcolm set the stage for, and how do we move that in this particular moment that needs it more than ever? With that being said, I will pause my spiel tonight and open up for a conversation if we can. I think I went over time. Any questions?